Alison, thank you so much for joining us today. Absolute pleasure to have you on us here at BioBytes. Alison, if you could start off with a bit of an intro about yourself. I will kick off a tiny bit here just because you have such an outstanding background, raised over $270 million, both in private and public markets, an R&D, CMO, true leadership executive member here who has been a part of both sides, understanding not just the science, but also the commercial aspect of any biotech business looking to be successful. So really happy to have you here, Alison, and if you could start us off, that would be amazing.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure and an honor to be on your podcast. And, um, it's very funny that I'm here because my background is started off to be very completely the antithesis of what I'm doing now. I started off as a diehard academic physician where pharma was just something that that produced medicines that were critical for patients, but we used them, but we really weren't involved in their making. And it was really, we were prescribers. And the key for me was really understanding mechanisms of disease. So I was trained as an intern at Hopkins. I had been to the NIH. I did my cardiology fellowship at Mass General, and all my mentors were physician scientists who uh, saw the pharma industry. At that time, it was something that helped us provide patients with disease modifying medicines, but really wasn't something that we were actively participatory in. More closely, we were interested in the science and how we could understand the science better as opposed to develop medicines. And that completely changed as time moved on, as biotech advanced, and there were some crossovers. People like Barry Kohler, who developed 2B3A Reapro, and he was chief of medicine at Mount Sinai, where I was, and he was really one of the first people. Judah Volkman, who developed the VEGF. So there were spots here and there of physicians that made that transition. And then there was Mark Fishman, who really was the first person that I had interaction with. He was chief of cardiology at Mass General. I was there, and then 10 years later, uh, at the request of Dan Vasella, took over Novartis Institute of Biomedical Research. And at that time, I had reached a certain level of success in academia. I had become a tenured associate professor. I was an immunologist and cardiologist, looking in very interesting juxtaposition of where the science and medicine could interact, inflammation and cardiovascular disease. And it turned out to be a very sexy place where medicine was actually going to go, although I couldn't have known that at that time, and got a call, from Mark Fishman and said, there's a place in translational medicine at NIBR, and would you, do you want to come in and stop, curing disease in pigs and non-human primates? Because I had built and helped build and was co-director of the Cardiovascular Research Institute and was very heavily interested in recruiting high talent. But at that point, there wasn't really an office like there is everywhere now in these institutions of an interplay between biotech and academia. Those offices of innovation, those were just starting to become a real thing. And there I was, given this sort of, this invitation, and sort of like a red flag in front of a bull, like, can you really make medicines that can help patients in a much larger way, as opposed to, as I was practicing also, help one patient at a time. And that's the real attraction of going into biotech or pharma, is that you can have an impact in a magnitude much larger than yourself, or one patient at a time.
Yeah, and Alison, I mean, you've worked in big pharma, Novartis, J&J, Sanofi, and of course worked in the smaller growing biotechs like Selecta as a senior member and a C-suite member. Um, could you speak towards what you found over your years in industry are essential for any successful biotech executive leader coming through? What are those qualities that make you stand out amongst others?
Well, I think one of the things that Novartis, which was unique, was the idea because it was created. There were a lot of in the translational medicine space, particularly, there were a lot of physicians that were coming over with the same background, and it was sort of given. It was a given, and my mentors, Trevor Mundell, Gervais Tuga, who passed away unfortunately, was the same thing was that we had in medical schools, see one, do one, teach one. So a lot of times you have these KOLs and you have people who are you act that people who are consultants who come in and pharma executives and especially biotechs, they come in and they ask them for key opinions. But if you've never run a clinical trial, if you've never actually treated the disease, one of the key things that's very helpful is actually to create a clinical trial, actually see a protocol, actually be part of that protocol formation, looking at even the granularness of sites, of what it is, what the impact is of inclusion, exclusion criteria, what it is to look at biomarkers and select a subpopulation. So all these things that roll off my tongue, but actually doing it so that when you're actually in the trenches of a biotech and it's a really make or break moment, you've actually done it. And so, even if you step back and you're evaluating a company to do a due diligence, having that knowledge of actually having done a clinical trial, um, even if you're leading it, but you're still in the trenches of it, gives you tremendous insights and focus over what is going to possibly be a success, what's going to take much longer. It gives you a tremendous amount of insights because a lot of times the people who are either presenting you with an asset or you have an asset really don't have that hands on knowledge. They're told it, and having that knowledge, even though it's very difficult, it takes some time to get it, but it's not impossible. It gives you a much better sense of knowing where inflection points are really going to happen. And obviously, in public companies, private companies, and for investors, that's critical information to know.
And with some of the things that you've just mentioned, what pieces of advice would you share with anybody who's an aspiring leader already at the top of the pinnacle of their space? What two bits of advice have you found most helpful throughout your career today that you would share?
I think there's a very clear line between micromanaging and having a deep understanding of what people are doing. So obviously, the overlying thing is respecting people's areas of knowledge. You're not going to come in there and run the trial. You have people who are going to help you do that. Um, but being able to understand their language, all the abbreviations that go along. What is an SIV? A site initiation visit. What is a CRO? What is an SOP? All these, acronyms that, roll off tongues. A lot of very high people don't know what they are. I think taking the time to understand what people are doing and understanding critical problems when they come up, understanding that it is a critical problem or it's not a critical problem, and then helping your team and empowering your team to help solve those problems or um, and being aware of them. So I think there's this balance of, at a CMO level, because I've been also a president of R&D where you take another step up, but respecting the expertise of your team, but also understanding that they can come to you with problems, when to come to you, and understanding because of your prior knowledge uh, what's important, what needs to be escalated, what can be done. And I think these are the things that can sometimes make or break a company. So I think, I don't want to get too granular, but, I mean, it's happened in a lot of companies, a non-human primate, there's a death in a preclinical study. I mean, if it's a public company, it's a reportable event. But, how do you go about that? Are there things in place? Who gets told? When do they get told? And how do you problem solve? And you look to your team, you empower your team, but you also are a sounding board for them. And that goes back, to leadership qualities of making them feel comfortable for them that they can talk to you and you're there for them to support them, and it's not in any way, there's no blame game. And because the stakes are high, there's often, it's unspoken, but there's also, I don't want to get blamed for this. I don't it's it has to be transparency, honesty, and respect. And those are the best companies that are able to where people at every level, the lab tech to the pharmaco, the PK person to the even the person who has the liaison between the CRO or the person handling the animal experiments themselves, that there's this communication and respect and transparency. And that's the key, that people feel that they can speak to you, and that they're not going to be this mutual respect of their expertise and of yours.
And I think you tapped into some of the next question that I wanted to go into. I think it's critical when we talk about culture. And a question that I always like to ask leaders at your level is, how do you foster an innovative and collaborative culture when you're growing an organization, whether that's a startup or whether that's a slightly mid-sized biotech that is adding key members, right? And whether that's replacing them or growing out different divisions, how do you continue to foster that collaboration and innovation?
I think when I joined, when David Epstein asked me to join Dexella and I took over, CMO, CDO, CSO job, obviously a huge percent of the company talked to me. I spent the first 3 weeks talking to everybody individually and asking them what is important to them. What do they think the strengths of the company are? What do they think the weaknesses are? What do they think their strengths are, and where do they want to grow? And I think people are just stunned that nobody talks to everybody, even at the highest levels, because I think there's a cursory relationship, a superficial, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but like, hey, how are you doing? We're CEOs and and presidents of R&D or whatever high up, there's a high five relationship, but it has to go deeper than that. And I think even in a company of 100 people, it's not on a daily basis, but in the beginning, when you're starting out as that leader, they need to know that you care about them individually as people, whether the company is right for them or wrong for them, but that you are interested in is them as people. And I think there is nothing that goes farther than that. I mean, I had an example of Barry Kohler, he was head of medicine and I was a lowly, researcher, and I got my first grant. I got a KO8, or it was an R01, I don't remember. But he came himself and he brought me a bottle of champagne. I will never forget that moment. I mean, he didn't have to do that. I mean, he is so busy, but yet it was an important inflection point in my career. Once you get that grant, you're starting on your way to being an independent investigator. And that respect that he gave me and knowing where I was in my career was critical. And I think you can do the same thing in biotech, where people, and that loyalty that you garner doing that goes both ways. It's a two-way relationship. And I have people that I've interacted with that remember me asking, how are you doing? Or remembering that they're having a milestone in their lives, whether it's scientific related, company related, or personal related. They had a child or they had something happen in their lives that's important. Obviously, it gets more difficult as you go into the big pharma and you have thousands of people that are reporting to you, but we're talking about the hundreds, that kind of thing. It is possible to do, or to have somebody help you, like a chief of staff, help you do that, so that you don't miss important inflection points in people's personal lives or professional.
Alison, in your experience, what are some key strategies that an executive leader can use when they're looking to build and maintain relationships with key stakeholders, such as investors, folks on the board, healthcare bodies, and regulatory bodies as well?
Yeah, I think the key is always, it's a little bit of playing 3D or 4D chess. You have to figure out what the major issue coming up is. And so if it's a regulatory stumbling block, if you're going in as a first indication for this particular area, which is something that is incredibly difficult, but then you focus in on talking to either regulatory consultants or regulators themselves, and very early on in the process, and saying, what would it take to have you look at this? And regulators are surprisingly open about this. And I think people are extremely worried about what regulators are going to think. And there's a lot of preconceived notions about, well, if you say this, they're going to want this. But I somebody gave me a very good piece of advice, is that when you come home at night, you don't even know what your partner is going to say. How could you possibly know what a regulator is going to say unless you ask them? So I think we are often given preconceived notions of regulatory hurdles that may, in our mind, become bigger than they are. Uh, Not to say that they might be that way, but to actually get on the phone with a, a regulator, have a good relationship, or have a consultant who has a very good relationship. And this is true of the EMA, MHRA, FDA, and or the PMDA if you're going to go through APAC. The other thing I think is that thinking out of the box. And we were lucky enough to have conversations, or be invited to have a conversation about our platform. And the FDA has a series of discussions that are internal, where you can present new research in how you're going about it, whether it's AI, big data, modeling, and it gives you exposure as a company, and also it gives your process exposure. And therefore, when you come around again, you may have an easier time.
And what advice would you give to emerging biotech executive leaders who are looking to navigate the challenges of scaling the company and also attracting investment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all about creating a story. I mean, I think sometimes very new or first-time CEOs and first-time teams will have to do things very linearly. We did this, then we did that, and you have a very narrow attention span for investors. You want to create a story that that's true, transparent, but may not be as linear as what actually, but it really encapsulates the idea and the image of the company, and what the promise of the transformational asset or platform that you're going forward. What can it be? And I think you have to start with that big picture, um, but create a story that makes it attractive and cogent and deliverable. I mean, we were working on something as unsexy as gout, and we talked about. I brought up the full point that there are a lot of people who get addicted to opioids because it's just such a painful disease that even if you put something as a sheet over your foot, that you can't even. It's unbearable pain, like analogous to passing a kidney stone. And I remember one of the investors says, "Oh, my brother-in-law had gout," and it was the beginning, the anchor of a pipe that, 20 million, because somebody could image it in their mind, the disease, and or a relation that had that disease. Obviously, cancer is easier because everybody has had experience with cancer, and obviously heart disease similarly. But again, uh, the that requires bigger trials, so people shy away from it. But in the rare diseases or um, things that may be harder for people to understand, these diseases where they may not have firsthand knowledge of them, creating a vision and an image that is medically and emotionally relevant sometimes makes a difference. And I know everybody says, oh, it's about the NPV, or it's about the money, it's about what the market share is going to be, blah, blah, blah. Yes, that's all important, but creating a vision of the disease and in the right circumstances, having stories about patients about makes a difference.
Excellent bits of advice there, and I think absolutely when you're trying to raise capital and you're speaking to investors, I'm sure they hear tons of pitches day in day out, and I think being able to really bring that story to life as an entire C-suite unit and trying to add value to the CEO, trying to portray the story that and the narrative that we're going with, I think it is critical to have that knock-on effect, and I'm sure every CEO would appreciate that as well. But fantastic. Alison, I won't keep
My
you any
pleasure.
longer.
No, no,
You,
and
you,
I think, yeah, and I think it's really important for everybody to have their voice in working as a team. The CEO, whether if the CEO is an MD, then that's, that person can provide that. If the CEO is not, then you could have the MD provide that. But working as a complete team, not reiterating what's already been said, because a lot of times people step on people and want to have emphasize something more. It's not always necessary to even rehearse that, so that it's natural. But to have that, if a team is working in synergy, like the Beatles, we can't all be, Paul, George, and Ringo. But if you have that, you know, that chemistry of riffing off each other in a very productive way as opposed to a reiterative way, I think it makes a difference.